Good afternoon. We are Reno High School's Unit 3. I'm Hannah Butler, and I will be attending the University of Nevada.
I'm Georgia Leland, and I will be attending Wake Forest University.
I'm Kathy Morse, and I'll be attending the University of Nevada.
And I am Andrew Tran, and I will be attending the University of Nevada. Our unit coach is soon to be Dr. Matthew Oakes, and our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark.
I'm Natalie LaFlamme. I'm an attorney from New Hampshire.
I'm Steve Jewett. I'm a judge from Orlando, Florida.
And I'm Thomas Mackey in the History Department at the University of Louisville and the Brandeis School of Law on U of L.
We are here on Unit 3, and the question for your consideration is number 1. That question reads as follows. The Civil War had a greater impact on American society and the polity than any other event in the country's history. It was also the most traumatic experience endured by any generation of Americans. Do you agree or disagree with James McPherson on that, and why? A couple other questions for your consideration is, what impact, if any, did the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have on America? And finally, what impact, if any, did the Civil War have on the social and economic culture of America? You may proceed.
The great issues of the war were not resolved on that April morning at Appomattox. In this sense, not only is the Civil War not over, it can still be lost. In agreeing with David Blight, professor of American history at Yale University, we must correct James McPherson's statement that the Civil War had a great impact on America, and instead contend that it is ongoing and is the most traumatic experience currently being endured by Americans. And while the Reconstruction Amendments have helped unite the nation, they have largely failed to accomplish all that they were intended to.
Although de jure slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, and a perversion of the amendment's statement except as punishment for crime, prisons leased convicts to private companies as a replacement for slave labor. Though convict leasing was outlawed in 1941, prisons such as Angola, aptly named for the plantation that used to lay there, have found legal loopholes to give convict labor to other institutions. These actions hold, as Justice Harlan describes in his dissent to Plessy v. Ferguson, a badge of servitude, and compounded with disproportionate prison demographics, they create a visual of contemporary slavery.
The 14th Amendment outlines the legal conditions for equality in America, but a lack of enforcement kills the normative 14th Amendment. The Freedmen's Bureau largely failed their mission to enforce the provisions of this amendment. As W.E.B. comments in The Souls of Black Folk, for this much all men know, despite compromise, war, and struggle, African Americans are not free. The 14th Amendment was effective when the Union Army occupied the South, but when they left in 1877, the redemption governments of the South were free to run rampant over the provisions of the 14th Amendment.
The 15th Amendment was written with the pretense of enfranchising all ethnic minorities, but Southern states found implicit ways to reverse this effect. In order to mend these injustices, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, the 2013 Supreme Court case Shelby County v. Holder struck down 2 sections of this act, allowing thousands of polling places to be closed in predominantly Black counties. Furthermore, states continue to disenfranchise minorities through statutes of voting ID laws.
While the United States has taken long strides since the Civil War in de facto social and economic processes, American culture and ideals that drive these processes are still much the same. Northern industrialization and Southern agrarian standards are both still represented by mode of offshoring. Following World War I, Black Americans experienced a great migration to the North in search of better economic possibilities.
The majority opinion of Plessy versus Ferguson outlines that legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane.
Socially, racist sentiments still remain in the United States through implicit and institutional racism. Racism in the public sector reflects in contemporary America, as real estate agents are more likely to show available housing to whites than equally qualified Blacks. And redlining is still prevalent 100 years after Buchanan v. Warley declared the government could not enforce racial zoning.
While the South lost the Civil War, they won the peace. After the war, African Americans faced abject social and economic deprivation. Institutions such as tenant farming, sharecropping, and the criminalization of blackness created what Du Bois calls a servile caste. He continues that the former slave and his future descendants
may not leave the plantation of his birth, bound by law and custom to economic slavery from which the only escape is death or the penitentiary. Before the courts, both in law and custom, they stand on a different and peculiar basis. The palm of the 20th century is the palm of the color line. Thank you.
Well, we have the 13th, the 14th, the 15th amendments, and then we've gotten, you talked about the Voting Rights Act, and we talked about the Civil Rights Act, I believe. But so we've got constitutional requirements, and we've got legislative things that supposedly are going to solve all this, and nothing's solved, from what I've heard. So why do we try? Why do we keep trying? If the racist things continue and discrimination continues, what's the point?
Because Stacey Abrams, a former Georgia gubernatorial candidate, asserted in a response to the 2019 State of the Union that the foundation of America's moral leadership around the globe is free and fair elections. And the fact of the matter that a lot of these minorities are being geographically discriminated against and cannot have their say in their government is a huge problem to America's entire moral leadership everywhere around the globe.
Additionally, our Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. This is a pillar of American society and polity, and even though we have not succeeded in realizing it, we are still trying.
Additionally, in the Constitution's preamble, in order to create a more perfect union, so we are striving for these ideals with all people, all races, colors, gender, etc., in order to create this more perfect union, and that is why we keep on trying in the contemporary America today.
I think you mentioned in your opening statement that legislation is powerless to stop racism. So, which is it? Do cultural factors kind of drive legal laws, or can laws actually affect people's behavior and the social world we live in?
Laws absolutely can affect the social world that we work in. After the striking down of the two sections in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, states enacted strict voter ID laws within 24 hours after that. And so the law was effective, but after the teeth were taken away from that, it became useless.
The entire thing that we have to look toward to is what these legislation says versus the actual practice of the legislation. And because legislation cannot mentally get rid of those racial instincts that people see, it can be completely powerless in order to actually get things done. For instance, in the South, there are tons more African Americans in prisons than every single other minority, and of course white people. 15% of people in the United States are African Americans, and they make up about 40% of the prison population. And this fact is compounded by actual actions such as over-policing of black neighborhoods, which is why we need to actually take action rather than put things on paper.
In contrast to my colleagues, culture can also influence our laws. For example, during the time of the passage of the 19th Amendment, or during the passage of the 18th Amendment, we had a rise in conservative Christian morality, and that led us to attempting to stop the sale of alcohol to people.
Yeah, and I think she put it very elegantly. I'm going to be a little blunter about this. Does law follow social and cultural change, or does cultural change follow the law? Which comes first?
Generally, culture would affect the laws. We can see that before the passage of the 19th Amendment, 38 states and the territory of Alaska allowed for women to vote, so it was very easy for the 19th Amendment to become ratified.
Additionally, just looking at the whole Civil War as a whole, the Reconstruction Amendments would not have been abrupt or born if it wasn't for the Civil War, for the culture of the mindset of black people were being enslaved, and we needed something to do about it. However, what we're trying to say is that we have these laws, and yes, they are effective in essence when it is being executed, but it wasn't. And what we're trying to say overall is The culture is affected by law, and if it isn't fully executed, then we're not going to have any progress whatsoever.
To take your question even a step further, I can say that sometimes legislation can be counterproductive to productive culture. We can see this in the hush clause of Article 5, which says that you cannot amend slavery until 20 years after the Constitution was written. And this was a huge problem at the Constitutional Convention, and rather than trying to mend this problem there, they pushed it off to future generations and did delay the abolishment of slavery.
So what's more effective in enacting change, laws on the state level or the federal level?
For example, let's just look at the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the flooring of state constitutions, correct? So we're building up, we're making more. So I would say federally, yes, the idea has to come from the federal level, but if the states aren't executing this, then we're not gonna have any progress. So when we see how the federal government tried to push for these laws and then immediately south states used loopholes, I would actually say, yes, the federal level.
I would like to disagree with my colleague. Brutus 1 explains how expediency in the state and more local level is way faster than it can be done in the state or in the federal level. And because these local representatives have more touch, more relationships with the people that they represent rather than people at the federal level, it's much easier to get these cultural shifts from the legislation of state governments.
The sign of a good time is when I have a but, or I want to go further. And I did want to engage a little more on that point there, but we don't have time for that because we have to move on. Good job, you guys. A couple of things. First of all, I don't like the breaking up of a quote. Like when you start saying something and then you finished it or around that. And maybe it's just, well, there you go. It might be just because I'm an old man and I can't hear well. I lose a little of it somehow. So she likes it, take it for what it's worth. She's, a young whippersnapper. She's still here. You didn't take the bait on my cynical, why should we care and why you can keep trying question, which I like. And you actually hit on two things that don't often come back at me. First of all, the reason we continue to try is because the Declaration of Independence, of course, we're trying to make it, and you brought in the Constitution with a more perfect union. Excellent, real good job. It's like, you know what, you old cynical son of a gun, take a seat, Grandpa, and we're gonna be all right, and we'll be fine. That's all I got. Good job.
Yeah. No, I thought the opening was useful. I didn't pick up on the quote thing, but that's fine. That I thought you did, the opening was very strong, and then got better in the give and take. I tried to put you on the horns of a dilemma of which comes first, legal change or social change, and there's no right answer. It's how you want to think through the problem, and that was the point of the question, was to think through the problem. And I thought you did a nice solid job there. And then going back to the nation's mission statement of the Declaration of Independence, using that as the touchstone is always a useful, important, even key way of thinking through some of these issues. Nicely done.
Thank you. I think you did a great job of, talking about what happened before the Civil War and these amendments, and then connecting it to today. I really liked your examples, and particularly I liked that you explained the example, like the prison labor, which I was like flashing oranges and black in my head, which I'm sure is what you were going for. But sometimes people just throw out an example, like, this is like this, and they don't really explain it. But I think you did a really good job of connecting, because when you explained it that way, I was like, oh my god, it is slavery. Holy crap. So that was great. I think you did a good job explaining the impact on the South, but I would just keep in mind trying to explain more about the impact on the North and kind of the nation as a whole, because these amendments, they were directed at the South, but they have done a lot for the country. So.
And the only thing I want to say, the expediency question about whether the states are better or quicker, I think we're done that, right?
You're real good.
But we are going through
It's only 155.
is that be careful, because there's good and bad to that, because it of course lends itself to say, well, yeah, but look at the Voting Rights Act stuff. As soon as it's off, they acted quick, but in a bad way. Whereas, and then you have the other stuff where legalizing marijuana and things like that, they can't act in that way. So if you're gonna take that position, then maybe you should, you know, make sure you get in that there's good and bad.
The judge always has the last word.